Globalization in reverse. The corona pandemic, the Ukraine war, and other conflicts show how fragile our societies and economics are. Globalization must and will change fundamentally in the coming years. We will see the greatest economic transformation since the dawn of the industrial age. In this high-level panel discussion, we will talk about the causes and possible future developments of globalization. Let's welcome Aditi Sarah Verghese. She's a policy lead, international trade and investment at the World Economic Forum, where she manages the Inclusive Trade Project and the Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. She previously led the Competition, Tax and Industrial Policy Project at the World Economic Forum and has worked as a trade remedies lawyer in New Delhi. Michael O'Sullivan is the author of The Leveling: What's Next After Globalization? It provides an analysis of the transition in world economics, finance, and power as the era of globalization ends and gives way to new power centers and institutions. Previously, he was Chief Investment Officer for International Wealth Management at Credit Suisse, having worked there for 12 years. Thank you, Mike. Harald Nikutta has been responsible for managing control risks business in German-speaking countries and Eastern Europe since 2016. He has considerable expertise in advising companies as they embark on growth strategies and seek to manage the complexities of operating in challenging environments. Before joining Control Risks, Harald spent the first 2 decades of his professional career in senior management of auditing firms. Welcome, Harald. The moderator of this panel is Richard Roberts, who leads much of Voland's analysis and ideation. His role involves leading on the new carbon economy inquiry and contributing to Voland's thought leadership on the future of capitalism, developing new ideas, researching, interviewing, authoring white papers and reports, as well as advising business leaders on how to set themselves up for future success. He writes on a broad range of topics regarding the future of business, climate change, and capitalism. Richard, the floor is yours.
Good morning and welcome to this panel discussion on globalization in reverse. That's got a question mark at the end in the description of this event. And my name is Richard. I have the pleasure of moderating this excellent panel this morning. Now, I'm hoping we're going to do rather more than just answer the question in the title of the session, because I know our audience will also be eager to hear the panel's views, not just on whether globalization is now in reverse, but on what the implications are and what we can do to shape what comes next. And in particular, obviously, we will then link this discussion to the global goals, this being the Global Goals Forum, and look at that question of how can we solve global challenges, the kinds of issues that are represented by the UN Sustainable Development Goals in a deglobalizing world. But before we get to do that, I do want to start with the context. Now, those of you who have just watched Michael's keynote will know that his thesis, boldly stated, is that globalization is over. And the sooner we recognise that, the better. Now, before we come back to Michael to elaborate on that, I want to give our other 2 panellists, Aditi and Harald, I guess a chance, first of all, to reflect on that analysis of where we are and how whether that resonates with your experience, whether that is kind of showing up in your work. So let me come to you first, Aditi, if that's okay. Now, you work on trade at the World Economic Forum, so in some ways have a front row seat in watching globalization. If you like, I think there are a few organizations that are more closely associated with globalization than WEF. So if I can come to you first, does Michael's thesis that globalization is over resonate with your experience?
Thanks, Richard. In short, I think that globalization is definitely changing. There are many actors that are expressing some form of a backlash to globalization for a variety of reasons, whether that's because of kind of job loss and wage stagnation in advanced economies, because of concerns around environmental and labor standards, lack of feeling of participation in rulemaking, and more recently around national security concerns. But there are aspects of globalization that are moving forward. If you think about trade and services and digitalization, certainly there moving ahead in many ways, and more importantly, globalization will be necessary to tackle a lot of the problems that are coming our way. So that's a quick reaction from me, and I'll hand over to Harold.
Very good. So Harold, you obviously help companies navigate many different forms of risk, and so you'll be, I'm sure, particularly well attuned to these sort of tectonic shifts, if you like, in the operating environment. So does the idea that globalization is over ring true for you?
I always have to take a deep breath. It is a statement which is making people thinking, but at the same time, I would just ask the question: was it on, and what has it meant? What are we talking about? It's just one word, and to say, okay, this one word is over, it's a little bit too blunt, because reality is a little bit more differentiated. And just to give you a different spotlight, I thought yesterday about it. What has been the advantage of all this, let's say, the decades after World War II? And if I'm really honestly looking on it and have to say, okay, what has been positive on what we've seen, regardless of how we name it? It is a very, 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 very short list of meaningful words. Actually, only two. And so even if it's over, do we miss something? And rather than talking about two broad topics, I would say, okay, what is in front of us? And I like very much to talk about these things, because the world is changing. And what we've been used to is a quite stable environment, let's say, at least for the last 30 years. I'm speaking particularly from the continental European point of view, where after the German unification and the end of turmoils in Yugoslavia, we have been through a very stable period, of course, with minor changes every now and here. But this is over now, so we see a lot of a changing paradigm, I guess it's the right word for it. And we better have to understand what it is. And particularly from company point of view, it is relevant. They will be international in the future as well, but they might work in different, let's say, jurisdictions plus, the US plus, maybe China plus, and the EU plus. These are the main areas where development and everything will take place. My point of view. And of course, the whole world will follow one of these three pots or just stay independent.
And thank you for that, Harold. And before I go to Michael, I just want to check on one thing you said. You said you think in the post-World War II era, there are only two things that have been good. But I missed, what are the two things?
No. There has been a lot good. And particularly when we talk about what has the, let's say, international development brought, good for everybody. Not in the meaning of I got more, you got less, and we have to negotiate at the end. And I think particularly access to knowledge, and the opportunity to develop, increased development has been a differentiator for many, not for all. And then, of course, all things related to trade that you can exchange with others. Yeah, you change your raw materials, your natural resources, your products against whatever it is. Has it been fair? Has it been equal? Has it been accessible for everybody? And whenever I think about one of these positive items, there's a long list of exceptions. Because all globalization, all internationalization has been driven by a clear purpose, and that has been basically profit thinking.
Yeah. Very clear. So there's lots I want to come back to there, but let's bring in Michael first. Now, Michael, I summarized your thesis in 3 words, but obviously you've written a book about this. You've thought very deeply about this. Perhaps you can give us a little bit more of your perspective on where we are.
So thanks for this debate. So I think, I mean, to go straight to the heart of it, I mean, you can define globalization, you can measure it. And I would define it as a world that's integrated and interdependent, and that's no longer the case. You can't have globalization anymore when the 2 biggest economies, the US and China, are barely talking to each other, and it seems doing everything that they possibly can to break down the integration of trade between each other. The semiconductors industry is a very, very good example of this. And globalization is simply, it's a different species or different variety of development and growth, and you can measure it by looking at the intensity of financial flows, people flows, where people are migrating, economic trade flows, etc. And all of those showed a consistent pattern in the last 30 or 40 years, and those patterns are now beginning to diverge. So I think you can say empirically globalization is over. We still have international trade of a different kind and a different sort. We still have international finance. We have people flows in very different ways. But globalization, I think, for me, is over, and I'm sorry to see it go. I mean, I would yearn for the world we had maybe 10 years or so ago. And I think if you look at some of the troubles that face the world today, things like rising inflation, rising interest rates, and a savage war, an invasion in Europe, those are things we've never had during the era of globalization. So to an extent, the fact that we're now experiencing these is, for me, proof that globalization is over and we're now entering into something new. And whenever you get this interim period where you move into a new phase, it tends to be very noisy and chaotic. The New World Order takes a long time to establish itself. And I do think we are going into a kind of a multipolar world where the US, Europe and China will be dominant economic poles, but will also do things very differently and according to very, very different values. We're seeing that, Germany is a good example in terms of the wake-up call it's had in terms of its security, its energy security, its military role. All of those are changing at light speed, and again, this is, I think, proof of that thesis. One final point from me, I think, which is important, is that one of the reasons globalization has come to an end is that it has produced side effects. Climate change being the most obvious and painful one that really curb its development. It has in some countries produced side effects like inequality, but I would make the point that the countries that are the most globalized, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand, etc., they don't have a problem with inequality as such, because they manage to distribute the benefits of globalization. And I think the UK and the US, both of whom have deep political stress, haven't done that.
Thanks, Michael. So it sounds like we're in agreement about that we're headed towards a multipolar world. But Harold, I saw you shaking your head there at the. I'm wondering if it's the word "over" that we're disagreeing on. But
yeah, well, I think it's too dramatic. And there's a wonderful example. I've spoken a couple of years ago to one of these ugly beasts of German Mittelstand companies, and we talked about business continuity management. And he said, look, for us as a company, it means always we plan without one continent. Either it's the US or America or Asia or Europe. Our core assumption is we have to survive even if we lose one continent, business-wise. And why is it? In due course of the Boxer revolution in China, we had to leave Asia, full stop. And that lesson learned made us so resilient. So what do I like to say with that example? If we take just a short period and look on it, of course, it's a lot of change in it. But if we have a broader look at it and now to nuances and take a little bit more regard on all the specifics, I think the category is over, is far too bold. Nobody can do anything meaningful with this. So we have to really differentiate. And if I look particularly from the little German point of view, 30 years ago, we had an Iron Curtain just in the middle of our country, right? And we couldn't even exchange 50 kilometers away from, for instance, Kassel towards the east. And for us, Russia has been a lot more meaningful than China. That has changed in due course of the A&Ds and 90s and everything else. And it's so meaningful for some companies. For others, it's still, of course, it's there. But you always have to look from which position you are talking about. Yeah, and I think we have to be a little bit more differentiated and then talk about, so what's behind it? Because with this dramatic thing, I can't do anything. What exactly is over? Can't we exchange people? Can't we trade? Can we bring people in? Can we bring people out? I think there's a lot going on. Of course, the multipolar world will have its impacts, and I fully agree, and I like this. But let's talk about what comes now, because then I guess it's a lot easier to agree. What's Anthropocene? Yeah, and Anthropocene, yeah, this is a multipolar world, and what does it mean for us as people, as broad organizations, as companies? And this is really an interesting chapter. And again, it needs a lot of differentiation. That will be a lot different from a UK perspective than from a German perspective, US perspective, Korean perspective, Japanese perspective. And I think we should be fair and differentiated.
Yeah. I want to keep moving forward, but Michael, you came off mute. Do you want to respond to that briefly?
Yeah, no, I mean, but you know, the proof of the point, Harold, is you can't move people anymore. You can't move people into Britain because they're threatened with being deported to Rwanda. You can't. Europeans can't go to Russia. Russians can't go to Europe. It's very hard to go to China because of COVID, because of politics. There are very, very few Europeans and Americans living and working in China. So, you know, to rebut human flows are no longer free. They're extremely constrained, and we can't do business freely as before. And again, if you look at places like Hong Kong, that's very much the case. Many foreigners are leaving Hong Kong because it's just becoming more and more repressive. So this era of openness is over, and it is very, very hard to put back together. It would be very hard to repair relations between Russia and Europe, and I fear China and the US.
But Michael, just briefly, we can still move to Spain, to Italy, to Portugal, to the US, to the whole of Africa, to most Asian countries. You're right. Some pillars are changing dramatically, and for those who are sitting in those, it is really a drama. From a UK post-Brexit perspective, I would say, yeah, I fully agree. The world looks really ugly. You might need later on work permits to even stay working inside European Union. Yes, that's a big major change. But when you look from a German EU perspective on it, yeah, well, the UK is not that important. It's a lot more important to stay as EU still in that pot. And you're right, for German companies and European companies all over the world, it's a drama what's going on in China. And we will see decoupling, we will see changing infrastructure, networks, everything. These topics are really hot and important. But there's a lot of Asia still accessible, Singapore, India, yeah, all these countries. So it is not over, it is changing. Some bits are over, others are even prospering. And I'm pretty sure when I think about what's the next, let's say China, what's Anthropocene regarding Ukraine, we have a different responsibility. Because look, for instance, 15 years ago, we would have never ever had a responsibility in Ukraine, not to the extent we now have. So there's a lot going on the other side as well. And this is what I'm really insisting on. Please, let's have a less pessimistic, blunt view on it, for making people think that's okay. But when we talk, what can we do with it? We have to be differentiated. We have to accept where people come from and where they go to.
Just two quick reactions, maybe. One on the movement of people. One reaction would be that of all the kinds of flows that we've seen through globalization, movement of people has always been the most restricted, right? And for most parts of the world, citizens for most parts of the world, including where I come from, that's always been restrictive. And I think the few examples that, Michael, that you brought up are clearly ones that affect people from the UK, the US, and some other Western countries. The other point that I would make is around what you said about in a multipolar world, when we have different economic blocks, even in the worst case scenario of decoupling between the West and the East, that would still require trade and investment, right? In order for some of these big players within both blocks to create those blocks in the first place, to buy allies or create partnerships within those blocks. And even between the two, complete decoupling between the US and China it's hard to see when that would happen and how long that would take and what the cost of that would be. So, I mean, for example, Eddie Beckers from the WTO and Carlos Goes from University of California have looked at what an East-West decoupling might cost in terms of welfare losses, and it's, what they say is it could be as much as 15% in some regions. These are quite dramatic shifts, and I'm just curious about how soon or how feasible you think that would be beyond kind of some of the critical sectors like semiconductors.
And so on the reshoring point, Aditi, is that something that comes up a lot in your work? Do you see, this is a trend people talk about in the big picture, but do you see many examples of companies really adapting their supply chains, I guess, particularly in response to COVID and some of the crises that have happened in the last couple of years?
This was definitely something that was coming up a lot, and I think there's stats on how often the term comes up in business calls and things like that. But in practice, I think what a lot of firms have realized is actually resilience comes a lot from diversification, and I think COVID definitely brought that front and center.
And so I want to talk a little bit about the global goals. Now, when we look back, in some ways, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement in 2015 came at the high watermark of the period of globalization, if you like, and it feels sort of in some ways a very different world when we look back. That was the year before Brexit and Trump, and the first indications that this multilateral system that we'd been used to was coming apart. So does that mean we need a complete rethink of how we go about the global goals? In many ways, the UN appears to be weaker and weaker. The COP process has met 5 more times since Paris, hasn't delivered any big breakthroughs. I wrote a piece after the Glasgow COP saying this process is broken. We need a new one. This isn't working. Do we need to do something different in terms of how we address these global goals? Because, as has also been noted in this forum, we're now halfway between the 2015 setting out of the SDGs and the 2030 target date, and we're not making enough progress. Michael, do you want to come in on that first?
I will. I mean, I share the urgency. I share the worry because, we can now see climate damage everywhere, north, south, east, west. So the urgency is extreme, and we're running out of time in terms of being able to repair some of the damage already. I do think that we need institutions and agreements with real teeth. What I mean by that is binding agreements where people have to pay for climate damage, and where there's a real onus on countries, governments, and also cities to really repair climate damage. I think, broadly speaking, with a very long horizon, I think in the 21st century, I think we need to think about the institutions of the future that we're going to need to police the 21st century, be it in cybersecurity, new global collaborative institutions. And I think there needs to be a global climate body, which I think has to be made up not only of governments and countries, but cities, other actors like companies as well. And I think if that doesn't happen soon, we will just continue to suffer self-imposed penance, to put it brutally, as climate warming picks up, as we see more damage to cities through flooding, or to agriculture through drought. I'm thinking, for example, of the east of Africa. So I absolutely share the urgency, and I share the despair that very little seems to have been done so far.
And I want to go to Aditi and then to Harold as well to comment on this. If we think particularly about climate for a moment, where that catalyst is going to come from, because in many ways the crisis is here. Whether you look at drought in Africa, whether you look at the floods in Pakistan this year, whether you look at the hurricane that's just hit Florida, all around us there are the symptoms of the climate breaking down, and in some ways to say, or how much worse does the crisis need to get before we get our act together on this? But maybe broader than that, you two may also have more faith in the UN system, in the COP process, etc., to deliver outcomes. Any comment on that, Aditi, first, and then Harold?
So I think in rethinking the global goals and how we achieve them, we do need to think a little bit outside the UN system and some of the traditional actors, and this is happening organically already, but we really do have to look at the full range of actors and tools out there. And so whether this is kind of more governments taking more unilateral actions that affect supply chain sustainability, for instance, and puts more onus on businesses, drive some of the sustainable supply chain sustainability initiatives from being more voluntary to mandatory, whether it looks like global unions fighting for workers' rights with direct global framework agreements with large multinationals, which they're then able to enforce through arbitration. I think there is a little bit of creativity that we're seeing amongst a range of actors in dealing with specific goals. It may not cover the entire system, but I think a key part of moving forward is making sure that there's a way to engage this broad range of actors that can take action.
And Harold, from your perspective, do you just despair at the UN process, or how do you see this?
It's so difficult to keep an answer appropriately short, but I might tell you where I come from. So I studied environmental politics in the late 80s, early 90s. I learned via Greta that I'm a climate vegetarian since 33 years already. And we try to be as CO2 neutral since early discussions about it as a family of 6, which is per se against whatever standard. At the end of the world, I found my silent moment in a book from Lockton. It's called Anthropocene. It's too far to talk about it now. But when we talk about it, so what do we need? We don't need a one-polar world or a globalized world. We need an institution, and less of an institution, more people who are able to draw a vision which is exciting and attractive for everybody. Access to water, to education, clean air, whatever it is. That can be driven by the UN, that should be underlined by experts. So to make an appealing, attractive vision, that's the way we like to live. So everybody is naturally looking toward that direction, says, yes, this is really a direction I like to take. Second, we need people who really want it. And when I look currently at how people are acting, particularly post-COVID, I highly doubt that everybody likes to be in a world of meaningful achievements for the sustainable goals, or SDGs. So I guess we have to educate people. I guess we have to show them the consequences. And in some cases, we might need more pressure. But usually, we are raising a few kids, pressure is not really helpful. It's more the meaningful motivation and making people think, okay, this is what we like to go for. And third, we need products and services and processes in line with the vision. And this is what I'm really sad about. It's because our history of the last decades has been that we had tried very hard to ignorate external costs, that we made arbitrage on social standards by bringing production all over the world by environmental standards. Everybody was aware when people work for less than 1/10 in a developing country, more or less on the same process, that there is something wrong, that there is a price we pay for it. And surprise, so many years later, we see it because it's touching now ourselves in our garden when we have brown lawn and everything else. So what I would like to say is this is a unique opportunity, particularly for companies, to rethink their business model, to discover purpose. And I can particularly speak for the German industry. It's a wonderful, probably the one moment in time opportunity, because this industry can solve problems, is reliable, and is working on a very high quality. What does it mean? We should think about how do we generate growth. And we have generated growth by quantity. In the modern world, we have to generate growth by quality. We have learned by media, by production, consume more and more and more and more and more, regardless of the quality in most cases. And I think slow it down and increase the quality, increase price, use less. That would be the right direction. And here it comes back to people, and here it comes back to the vision. So what do we need at the end? We need a vision which is transferable or translated to the needs and the life of the people. That they say, okay, clean water, what does it mean for me and my daily doing? And we have to deliver this kind of translation in all countries, in all cultures, in all languages. And that might be a little bit different, but I'm strictly critical against just setting up a new institution and blah, 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 and make it powerful and meaningless and giving it teeth. No, that probably won't work. And in these tired and silent moments when I'm really a little bit frustrated, I again read Novocene, and then I think, yeah, we probably have to accept as human mankind that we are only one short chapter of this world. But let's make the best out of it. And everybody should think about it. What does it actually mean if we are only one short chapter? And I personally recommend our kids act the whole day that you can take a serious look into the mirror. Yeah. Whenever you decide whatever it is, on mobility, on consume, yeah, it is the sum of individual decisions which we see today. And if you buy a cheap product where social standards are violated, that's probably not the best choice to invest your pocket money. You should think about it. So I would love a completely different discussion. I would love a discussion about behavior, about help for people to better understand, and about something which is appealing and attractive for everybody. And of course, which aggregates at the end to something which is very, very similar to the SDGs.
I would jump in, if I may, as a co-moderator for this thing. I would pick up what Michael O'Sullivan said, where he said, or at least this is the way I understood it, that some of these discussions about reducing consume, about responsible consume, is also a first world discussion, yeah. So of privileged societies, and in other words, in other parts of the world where you do not have the resources, it's a question of surviving the day. So and then Harald, you said, well, sometimes we are very well in separating, let us say, conscious and consume. So if we buy jeans, for instance, yeah, we don't ask about working conditions of people, and therefore I would like to pass this to Aditi, and because I know you're very much in the labor condition, the work with labor conditions and these aspects. So let's talk about the past. Let's have a look at the future. And so in the past, we didn't make it very well of for instance, adopting human rights in labor conditions. So now if I understood Harald well, we've got the once in a lifetime opportunity to make it better. What shall we do?
Thanks, Alma. So one quick reaction to Michael and Harold's discussion before would be, yes, in Europe and parts of the developed world, we've had high labor and environmental standards, but of course, and this is not a new point, a lot of that was because there was an ability to outsource manufacturing in other parts of the world where those costs were borne by other societies, and that's what made it financially possible for consumers in the developed world to continue to enjoy a clean environment and high labor standards, because that cost was being borne elsewhere. So that's just a slightly different way to look at that dynamic, I think. But I mean, looking forward in terms of where labor and human rights conditions could be improved, I think that what Europe is looking at now in terms of supply chain due diligence legislation, which would place more of an onus on companies that are operating and have revenues in the EU to look at their entire supply chains, at least to the extent that they have direct business relationships with suppliers in those supply chains, and make sure that adverse effects are tackled. I think all these moves to making it more compulsory and regulated are positive. And I think that's what Richard was getting to as well. The fact that there's an understanding that voluntary approaches aren't enough. I mean, we need to learn from them, because there has been a good 20 plus years of supply chain sustainability initiatives to learn from the private sector. But I think a lot of where the actual action will come from is from regulation.
I would like to pass this your answer also to Michael, because Michael, you said some parts in the future will not talk to each other any longer. Yeah, so we've got a conflict, let me say, between US and China, and so how can we make, let me say, how can we impose human rights in China, for instance, with the Uyghurians? Yeah, so what will happen to in Hong Kong and all these other parts?
See, you can't impose human rights on China, because China will say that this is part of its internal security. So what you can do, I guess, in this world of new data-intensive supply chains, is you can impose conditions on trade with China, that you will only trade with Chinese companies where you can be absolutely sure that there's no forced labor or human rights abuses involved. And that's the same with many other countries. We're going into a world, I think, of supply chains where there's a sort of sense of trust but verify, that these supply chains are now more data intensive. We know an awful lot more about the provenance of the goods and services that we're getting. That probably pushes up their price. It probably leads to a bit more scarcity, but it also tells us that we are going into this world where, instead of a world dominated by kind of classical geography and trade, it's now a world dominated by values. And each of the big regions will set its own standard and barometer of values upon which it will trade with other countries. And Europe, I think, is slowly emerging in that regard as a continent that has got a values-based economic zone. I think we will, even within Europe, we will see, for example, more pressure put on countries like Hungary, which is in many respects contravention of European values, certainly politically, and is behaving in a very provocative way, for example, in the context of what's happening with Russia. So I think this is just the beginning of a trend, and not just between sort of Europe and China, but also within Europe.
I will immediately hand over to Richard, but I would like to have an extra question to you, Michael, but also to Harald and Aditi. You were talking, or you said, it seems like, values, we will have parallel values in a world with parallel value systems. But I was thinking at this moment, well, values has to do something with ethics, so with moral. And how can it be that, or at least maybe you have to explain it to me, how does a world work with parallel concepts of ethics? Harald, maybe you first.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. As it did in the past is the answer. There hasn't been one set of unified values all over the world. At least not as far as I know. And but we are a little bit taken by surprise that the assumption of convergence was wrong. Full stop. But what we've learned is diversity per se is always very good. I'm not 100% sure if that's valid for values as well. But at least I would like to ask the provocative questions. So what's the value of unified values? What's the value of harmonization, of standardization? I can say you what the value of monocultures is when we look in the German forests. So we learn now that diversity is probably a key to many solutions. However, we need probably a set of or a core understanding. And I'm not 100% sure whether that will be respected by all jurisdictions all over the world.
But let me pass this to Aditi. What kind of a value system is this where you say, okay, labor conditions and human rights today in this country, yes, but in that not? So is this acceptable? Harald says it's the way how it works, yeah, but that's shouldn't be the roadmap for the future, or that's.
Yes, so I mean, I think there are some values which are more kind of universally accepted, or at least beginning to be accepted, than others. I mean, so just to take a step back, when the WTO was set up and trade liberalization there was really premised on, regardless of whether you're a liberal democracy or not, you can participate in the system, right? Even if you were a non-market economy, you could, and this international set of rules would act as an interface between these kinds of different types of economic systems. And so when Canada and others withdrew MFN status from Russia and Belarus earlier this year, that was seen as a big departure from that way of thinking. And so there's a whole set of values around, democratic systems and so on, which may not be as universally accepted. And so I think the new question here with trade especially is, are we seeing parallel trade systems based on those kinds of values? I think what's less contentious is a trading system that is sustainable and inclusive. So really thinking about environmental and societal values. I think that there's a much stronger case to be made for that. It's in the WTO founding documents, for instance, already. And so there are plurilateral discussions, at least on the environment side, occurring at the WTO because of that. I think that would be my response. You're on mute. Elma, you're on mute.
Apologize. Michael, I would like to pass this question to you because you said we are living in a time of an interregnum, which is also sometimes characterized by these kinds of conflicts because we are leaving something and don't know yet what will be the future. And so it's also a kind of a rivalry of political models between maybe democracy and autocracy, which we are seeing right now, and a kind of a rivalry and competition of value systems. But what we hear now very often is, okay, we, democracy, etc., must win because we've got the best system in moral aspects, but it's not the only point that could make it. So how can we solve this kind of rivalry of value systems?
Yeah, this is a very long topic, and I think the world is clearly going into one that is cleaving between countries that are non-democratic and democratic, and the invasion of the Ukraine is a very good example of that. If you look at the way China has sided unquestioningly with Russia, and also if you look at the way democracy has been meddled with in the UK, the US, and in Europe, and also I think, to be quite fair, the way many politicians themselves in those countries have degraded democracy, in particular in the Boris Johnson in the UK and Donald Trump in the US. And democracy for me is something I hold extremely dearly. If you look at countries that are non-democratic, people crave democracy and they crave openness. Iran today is just a superb case in point. So it's absolutely something worth fighting for. And I think we can do a number of things. One is strengthen our democracies against outside influence. And that goes from espionage to electronic voting, to political funding, etc., and the media. I think experiment also with new ways of looking at democracy. In Ireland, for example, we have the Citizens' Assembly, which has been set up where ordinary citizens can devise legislation and put that forward, for example, in referenda. And then I think the third one, which we've talked about, is to trade on the basis of our values and trade on the basis of the fact that we are in Europe a liberal democracy, and trade with those high standards. Maybe a final one I would say is that in Europe there is a lot of talk about values and democracy, but it's very high level. And I think European politicians need to do a much better job of making this tangible to ordinary Europeans and just telling them what do European values mean to me as an Irishman, to Harold as a German, and maybe to a French person, a Latvian, etc. And how does that bring us together in terms of the shared component of that?
I would like to pick up what you said about strengthening organizations, and I think this is an interesting aspect I would like to discuss with you. So sometimes I have the feeling that the last thing the world as the global community agreed on was the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 and the SDGs in the same year. So, but since then, what we see is more and more turning back to each other and less giving hands. But again, when we look at climate change and other things, we cannot solve problems alone. So we have this kind of multilateralism must continue. Maybe not in the way it is right now, but it must continue. On the other hand, what we see is this kind of multipolarism and multilateralism as an experience. We haven't tried if it works well together. It's like two chemical ingredients. We have to see how they fit. But let's shape the future. Aditi, what's about global institutions? What do we need? What can go away? So and what must change?
So I'll stick with what I know. So I'll talk a little bit about the WTO and not claim to have a plan for the entire international legal order. But I think at least with the WTO and the rules-based multilateral trading system, I think it's one of those things that it's easy to take for granted until it goes away. And so I think that the fact that some of the biggest trading powers in the world don't have free trade agreements with one another, is a good reason to hang on to the rules and institutions that we do have. So even if the WTO didn't create any new substantive trade rules today, it would still provide value because it's administering the ones that we do have. If the appellate body of the WTO didn't hear another case, it would still be valuable because the WTO provides space for member states to raise trade concerns, to notify their measures, to be subject amongst all the other members to periodic review, and all of this helps the trading system move ahead, and smaller economies and businesses rely on this the most. Another kind of point here, I think, is what we saw when the US during the previous administration launched various challenges to the WTO, whether that was through leading to the appellate body to become defunct, or the steel and aluminium tariffs, the China tariffs, at one point even holding the WTO budget hostage. What we saw was not other countries abandoning the organization, but really stepping up to try and have a real conversation about reform, and to have and to create an interim body to hear appeals. And so I think that all just goes to show that these institutions do matter, and there's very little political will, at least that I can see, to create new ones. And so there is a need to reform what we have. And I think some of the main issues that have been brought up are around reinvigorating the negotiation function, restoring the appellate body, transparency and monitoring, and tackling this very thorny issue of special and differential treatment, which is a big issue between the US and China in particular, and India and others. But those are just a few thoughts, at least on the trading side.
Harald, Aditi said it's time to clean up international organizations. So what to keep, what to throw away?
Probably the last person you should ask about international institutions, because I don't know anything relevant about it. Maybe I can refer more broadly to why should institutions survive? Very simple, when they bring value. Yeah, in the outside economy, companies should only survive when they are sufficiently profitable, full stop. When we talk about the institutions, they all have a purpose. If they deliver appropriately against the purpose, they should survive. If not, they should change or be finished off. At the same time, we are all aware delivering value according to your mission is quite difficult and changing over time. What we've seen in the past is that the institutions usually learn through challenges. What does it mean? Assumed that no institution can perform on a highly consistent level for forever. We have to give, particularly those institutions which are a little bit, let's say, short in delivery against the mission or purpose they have, the opportunity to adjust. And that again needs a critical discussion about the quality of delivery. And that should be done particularly by, so to say, the clients of those organizations. And what I see is usually whenever we start to audit, whatever we audit, it's not really delivering on the spot. So we have to rethink how we measure and how we get a better picture of quality of delivery of those organizations. And before, we should really draw some kind of a map. Where do we actually have need for delivery of what kind of purpose? And map those organizations against the need. And then we might come up with a few blind spots or whatever it is. And of course, then we have to fill it. Sometimes very simple principles work. And I just refer to my experience at home. We have a simple rule on top of our private building. Whenever something moves up, something has to move down. Yeah, otherwise you end up in a whole set of rubbish, which you don't like. And maybe we should do it with the institutions as well. They have to justify their existence based on the value they deliver for their, so to say, clients. That will be my procedure. And we then simply have to say, okay, not fit for purpose. Goodbye.
Michael, I pass this over. You also argue that institutions have to change and have to adopt. What do you say?
I think some of the institutions we've talked about, like the World Trade Organization, have just lost total credibility. And if you look, I mean, the big nations just ignore them, and they have a crisis of relevance and of leadership, and that's one of the reasons why globalization is in trouble. Other institutions like the World Bank, I think, have done to a large degree what they were set up to do, and the world has changed around them. I would argue the World Bank should be relocated. All of it should be relocated from the US to Africa, because that's where it's probably most needed. And I wouldn't bother. I think bureaucratic institutions are very, very difficult to reform and change. That's just the reality of those kind of organizations. And I wouldn't bother trying. I think it's much better to look at the plans of the institutions for the future and the new challenges that we have. I mentioned cybersecurity being one. Mental health, for example, now is another important aspect of global health. And we also need new institutional arrangements for new kinds of money, crypto money, digital money, etc. So there's plenty of really exciting challenges out there, and I wouldn't waste my time with the World Trade Organization and trying to improve that. I think it's much better spending time looking at the institutions of the future and trying to figure out ways in which they can work in a very new context.
Aditya, I would like to give you space to answer, because you were arguing in favor of World Trade Organization and Michael wants to throw them away. So your chance.
Yeah, it's a little intimidating to go up against Michael, but I think just what I would say is that not waste time on the WTO, etc. I just don't see the political capital to create the kind of institutions that you're looking at and think are necessary. And I can't imagine world trade going as it did through COVID and all the kinds of shocks that came up without a set of international rules. So if you're saying to get rid of the WTO, are you also saying to get rid of all the international rules that we have right now that deal with trade, that allow smaller countries to participate in the trading system, who would otherwise be left to the mercy of bilateral, very unequal power relations? I couldn't really imagine that world, and I don't think that it would have a net benefit to deal with the kind of problems that we're talking about here, including sustainability, including future crises.
Please.
Yeah, maybe just one sentence to it. Very often we have created institutions because we think it has to be good for the purpose we just like to be after. But we randomly talk to, so to say, the clients. It's like innovation and product development in your ivory tower. And I just would like to give you one example. So for more than 40 years, we thought our development aid might be quite fruitful. So we have established an organization helping people all over the world to do something. And we thought that's exactly the way it should be. And I had now the pleasure to meet every now and then a few people who have worked for their whole career. And whenever they have a silent moment, they said, you know what? Nope. We thought it has to be that way. We fully failed. I have to look now back on a career which was a waste of my energy, of my motivation, which was harmful to the people we tried to help because it was only our thinking. So appropriateness for the purpose and alignment with those who should be helped, that's the key for the institution of the future. We are not wise enough, not good enough to centrally think, okay, that has to happen. And I think particularly in the modern world of communication, we can ask the fish what we shall put on the hook to get him there where we would like to have him. And this is what we still haven't learned. And it's probably even worse in institution and the public and governmental arena than it's in the business arena. But particularly here, every single day I'm after those institutions and tell them, guys, you should look outside your perceived reality. What you see around your little table, this is not reality. This is only your perception. And in the outside, that might be completely different. So a critical check, I would recommend every institution.
So if I understand you correctly, none of you wants to go back to the good old times of the past. So you want to have a different future. And so my question is, do we really have the knowledge what the future should look like? So what if the way we look at problems itself is part of the problem? So therefore, I would like to pass this to Michael. The question: do we have all the instruments ready to make a good step into the right direction?
That's a very difficult question. We don't have the knowledge at all. I mean, we can look at history as a guide. The last time globalization came apart in the 1910s was a very bad case study, and we should at least learn to avoid the mistakes of history. And we're not doing a good job of that just yet. I think one of the things COVID and that period has taught us is that we have the will to mobilize people, and we have a lot of scientific and technological knowledge, and that's quite exciting in terms of all the improvements that can bring. But that needs to be marshaled in a positive way. I mean, the final thing I would say is we just have to be forward-looking. And just I think a lot of the difficulty in debates today is really just in accepting that, where we can debate whether globalization is fully over or not, but just accepting that this phase has ended and we have to move forward, and people set their minds to constructing something else as opposed to just dwelling on the past. I think that's one of the biggest behavioral issues that we face today.
Aditi, what Michael said right now sounded a little bit to me like driving a car at night with no lights on. So, because we go to a future which we don't know and where we don't have maybe all the knowledge to do so. So how should we handle it?
So, I mean, I think the data question is a big one, and maybe one way to depoliticize and going back to your question of how do we have a multipolar world and multilateralism at the same time, I think part of it is to depoliticize some of the questions that we're asking. And so, on specific issues, we've actually found that you can have combinations of countries that wouldn't work with each other at a higher kind of political level. So, I mean, again, going back to the examples that I know well from the WTO, we were able to have, in the middle of a war, able to have Russia, Ukraine, the US, EU, etc., at the table at the last ministerial conference, agreeing on things like fisheries subsidies, disciplines, and vaccine waivers, IP waivers, at a time where they weren't talking to each other in other organizations, right? So in a time where in other organizations, the moment the Russian delegates started speaking, everyone else would stand up and leave. So I think that a lot of finding the answers is looking at more specific questions, not trying to tackle the entire piece, but focusing on specific issues and trying to find agreement amongst often an unlikely set of countries on specific issues.
Harald, so if I understand you correctly, you said about some companies don't make such a fuss, adopt yourself to the change we are seeing. But how can companies do it if they, if they really don't know what is the right way?
Well, the good news is they never knew. So it's just a prolongation of what we have experienced since we are there, number one. Yeah, and number two is, I probably have expressed myself not sufficiently clear. The companies have to make a fuss. But what we have to learn is, and here I completely agree, and I agree on many, many points with Michael, hopefully that comes across in the right way, that the times are changing significantly. So I brought up, so to say, in the Roman Latin manner, with a ceteris paribus assumption. Yeah, you look at one thing and everything stays stable. That's the way I was educated at university as economist. Always in a stable world. Assumption, only a few things are changing, then no multidynamic models. This is what companies and their thinking is used to. And what we see particularly now is everybody has to accept, okay, we have multi changes at the same time. So we have to rethink the way we think, and our core assumptions are changing, sometimes even overnight. And we have to deal with it. We have to think in scenarios, which we hadn't to do after the reunification in Germany, particularly for the Germans. This is now changing. And good news is, we have been quite used to in the past before. My little example at the very beginning might be a kind of proof to that. The last bit I would like to make is, and again, maybe a little bit thought too little, but particularly from a German point of view. I'm so grateful that we've been taken back to the international community. Particularly when I now look nowadays on the map of Ukraine. My father, when I was a little kid, talked a lot about it because he was soldier there some 80 years ago. And I feel very sorry for the older people to experience a second time a war. And I hardly can imagine how terrible it is. But thanks to all nations, they allowed us to come back. And we always should keep in mind, at the end of the day, Russia will be Russia even in the future. We have to deal with it. China as well. At the end, it's only one world. There might be periods when some nations have to be excluded, and they have to be excluded. And I fully agree. We need organizations which are strong, which can say, this is the end, you don't go across this border. And we need these international bodies to protect the others, the coalition of the willing, I would describe. But we always should keep our minds and our doors open to allow everybody to return to the table. And the good news currently of these partly dramatic changes is everybody will be affected in the private life, as you said in the very beginning. Thunderstorms here, blizzards there, the dryness here, whatever it is. We will experience it from now on every single day, either at home or in the news, that the world is changing. And hopefully that will change people's minds regardless where they are and come back to the organization of the willing. And this is what I strongly believe. Those who are capable, have the resources, the knowledge, and really the willingness to drive change, they have to. They even have to accelerate all their investments in it, their motivation, and they have to lead by example. We can't just hide behind legislation. And I give you one example. A discussion in an industry representation on Thursday about the new Supply Chain Act in Germany. And somebody said, okay, what can I do to do as little as possible? And these are the moments when everybody has to stand up and speak. We can't allow in those, let's say, potential active communities that we have people with this attitude. And we really have to stand up and make sure this is the coalition of the willing, and they have to progress, they have to take the bulk burden and allow the others to follow. And I think with this kind of attitude, this is changing the whole game as well. And to bring it to an end, and for that, Michael, I fully agree. We need bold statements just to kick people out of the comfort zone. And here I like your title, Globalization is Over. Behind, I'm thinking highly differentiated about it, but always we have to think about what do we like to achieve. And you did. So congrats on that title.
So allow me to have the last round of questions and to bring together sustainability and globalization. Harald, I would like to start with you because I read in LinkedIn an article you wrote a couple of days ago where you said now it's the time for the SDGs transformation. What makes you so confident that transformation or the change you described now will be a sustainable version and not the version you described with this business representatives saying, well, what's the way you can do without investing less in this?
Similarly to what we've had regarding the Greens, the discussion about sustainability is now entering home and entering the companies. Why home? Because the kids are talking about it. They're really reflecting, okay, we have to live in this world and we don't agree. Fridays for Future might be an example. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. At the same time, we now have the competency to deal with these topics and the willingness, and people understand, okay, there's a business case behind. The whole discussion, regardless of what I think about purpose, those statements, like from Michael, make people think. And I have the impression the core assumption should be always everybody likes to leave the world in a better place than he or she has found it. I believe everybody likes to be a contributor, not only a taker, particularly a giver as well. And with these core assumptions, this is just the only consequence we can take. And we see now if we don't take it proactively, there's a high price to it because we will lose parts of our economy, parts of our wealth, parts of our well-being, parts of whatever it is, particularly in a country so federal as Germany. We have to make sure that our hidden champion, the heritage of our federalism, the economical heritage, social heritage, will stay alive. And this means they have to move. And particularly for this economy, I'm confident because they are problem solvers, they are reliable, and they have good processes. So they are very effective and efficient. And this competency can be just applied to whatever topic it is. And it's only an inch away. And as so often, when you like to change something, you need resources, and our economy is capable to do it and to lead the process. And so we have to do that. And I'm really confident if we pray loud enough, if we say, look, in this dark room, there's one door and there's a light channel or whatever light room behind, just go there. They will do. I'm fully aware. And we did it. I just looked a couple of days on the picture of Frankfurt in 44. One out of 2,000 buildings in city center was still standing. Everything else was done. Imagine what we created out of nothing. I looked at the forest map of Germany just a couple of 100 years ago. We have been down to 20% forest in Germany. Now we are back on 40%, highly diverse. We can do it. We can change the world. We can make all places to a better world. I highly believe in technology, but I believe that we have to help people to apply it. We have to help people to apply the SDGs in their business models. So that's a different way of consulting. And we just have to be loud and meaningful and sometimes even bold. Yeah, that's my belief. Otherwise, I probably can't get up. And I still do. And I love it.
Michael, at the end of the interregnum stands the coronation. So what do we have to do to have a sustainable coronation?
That's a good one. Just as a final point, I think maybe three things. One is bear in mind the lessons of the peace and prosperity of globalization and work to those as goals. I think second is massive focus on technology and innovation and doing innovation in a really very, very clever way. And I think in Europe, I think just a much more bottom-up focus on for ordinary Europeans and what their values mean and what sustainability means. I mean, Harold has talked about some of this, and just get that into people's mindsets and the way they live and they act.
So Aditi, World Economic Forum is a important playing ground for mapping the future. We were recently talking about a map of drawing what needs to be saved in the future, and about your work. So what do you think? How can we make sure that sustainability stays a top priority in business and negotiations and business discussions and sea floors?
I'd like to actually borrow from what Harold said earlier about, there's a need for the trade policy community and institutions to create a vision that people can buy into and can actually see themselves in. And I think for me, what that looks like is remembering that trade and investment are important drivers for growth, development, innovation for many parts of the world, especially the developing world. And they're also key for the crises that are coming, whether it's climate or another pandemic. And then the second point is really, there's the backlash to globalization is completely understandable, and we need genuine reform of trade rules and institutions. But doing away with them, with what we have and starting from scratch, I think is untenable given the political situation we're in right now. And then finally, I think we need to think about greater support for underrepresented actors. So again, going back to how do we make sure that everyone sees themselves in the next phase of this project. And I think that looks like making sure that workers, minorities, local communities, indigenous populations are truly part of the process, and not just governments and business. And really supporting the programs that help SMEs and developing country actors access markets. And I think, looking at institutions like the International Trade Center that do that really well is helpful.
Well, thank you. So maybe globalization is in reverse, but we all agree that civilization is not in reverse and should not be in reverse. And this is maybe where we have to work on in the future. And I think I heard a lot of very, very smart and thoughtful ideas. And I thank you all for this discussion. I would like to thank you also, Richard, for the beginning of the discussion. And also take care and hope to see you soon.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.